This is Charles Russell, and I'm the host of Democracy to New Hampshire. This is the show where we explore people, politics, and the process and how government works. Tonight our guest is Steve Shaw, a writer that's involved with the governmental process. Good evening, Steve.
Thank you, Charlie. Nice to be here.
It's, we want to draw a little comparison or parallel through the years of history, how writing has been integrally involved with government through the years. And the first book is Aristotle, the Politics, and obviously was written in Greek and has been translated, but written 23 centuries ago. It was a careful study of 150 city constitutions to see how government could best serve men and their needs. Concord recently reviewed its city charter, or city constitution. I don't know if they went through that and made any comparisons, but have you read any of this, Steve? Or,
yeah, a little bit. I'm
familiar
with Aristotle, the Greek city-state.
Through the years, this book certainly has been a main document that people have relied on for how the Greek civilization was established.
Yeah, politics is a Greek word, for example.
So he created that word?
Yeah.
And how do you feel that government and language have interacted through those years, through 23 centuries?
Well, I think we were talking about plain English laws earlier, and also I think you're going to read an article from the New Hampshire Constitution about the right to revolution, which is a real interesting article. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a connection between language and revolution, and that if the if the people can understand concepts in the law that are written in plain English, or really we're talking about analogies here, or something that you can understand and relate to in your own life, then you have a key or an access or a wedge into government that gobbledygook or legalese prevent you from having. Mm-hmm. And very often, if a law is explained in terms of a narrative or in terms of a story, it's understood much better than if it's left in legalese that only attorneys will argue over. There's also, you mentioned Aristotle, but I think that there's actually a biblical connection here too, because the first 5 books of the Bible are called, in the Old Testament, are called the Law. And 2 of those books are narratives, Genesis and Exodus. The other 3 are actually statutes, like RSAs. Mm-hmm. It's clearly more interesting to read Genesis and Exodus than it is to read Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Numbers. And as a matter of fact, the way the Bible is organized, those 3 books of law come out of the narrative in the beginning. And that connection is very important biblically. I think what's happened a lot of times in modern society is we end up only with the proscriptive laws, but we don't understand the narrative that went into it. Mm-hmm. Partly this is legislative intent that I'm talking about.
Yeah, how they came about.
How they came about. And that's the plain, I'm associating plain language with that. It's not only how the law is written, but where it came from and what it means and what it's trying to accomplish.
Well, certainly there's been a lot of codes, Hammurabi's code, the Ten Commandments that have carried through.
Right. That's Hammurabi's great accomplishment, was to pull together various statements, and there was no connection. That's what codification is, allowing public access to various statements and putting them together in a way that they can be understood. I can give you an example in New Hampshire. There used to be a statute that required school buses to be inspected at least once a year, and another statute that required all vehicles to be inspected at least twice. Now you could put that together to mean school buses could be inspected once, twice, or 3 times. The agency that was enforcing that interpreted it as 3 times. People who own school buses interpreted it as once. Mm-hmm. You really need somebody, and I got into this because of codification, you need somebody to point out that that can be interpreted 3 different ways. Mm-hmm. Anticipate that question, and then in plain English answer it, so that we have some idea of what those statutes mean. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, at least once, at least twice, the at least doesn't tell you enough to know how to comply with that. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about rulemaking a little bit. In this particular case, the rule would say 3 times. It would anticipate that you could have 3 different interpretations of those statutes, and it would answer that so that the public knew what the requirement was.
Clarifies it, yeah.
That's a good example of plain English, not necessarily language, getting rid of notwithstanding or heretofores. It's anticipating the questions that the people would have in reading the law and answering that question up front. Yeah. That's what I'm referring to as plain English.
Well, New York has a law written about 15 years ago. It's called the Plain English Law. It basically says that documents or contracts require written agreements that be written in clear, coherent manner, using words with common everyday meanings, that they be appropriately divided and captioned by its various sections. Mm-hmm. And it talks about one of the basic principles is that if someone can't understand the language or the words or the manner it's written, they certainly can't agree to what is going on, and certainly would raise it if they felt there was a problem as it was tried to be enforced.
Yeah.
And
language or laws could be written in such a way that the rights are precluded without you even knowing what happened, when actually they're supposed to be establishing rights and giving you a menu or many choices. That's what a law should do.
Now, this book goes on, you're aware of federal as well as state rulemaking manuals, but this book goes on to say, don't say commence, initiate, say begin.
Yeah.
Adequate number of, sufficient, use the word enough. Termination, expiration, end. Pursuant to, use under or after. Subsequent to, why not just after? And certainly that would break up the sentences, make the reading much easier, much more understandable.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Does New Hampshire have a plain English law for some of its contracts that you're aware of?
Well, they do for rulemaking. There's a requirement that rules be written in plain English. I think that there's a certain irony involved here, because many agencies who try to meet that, when they go through the rulemaking process, they find out that someone else reading that doesn't understand it. Mm-hmm. We have a problem right now where the regulated community would understand terms of art, but a person who was outside the regulated community wouldn't. Mm-hmm. That law is being interpreted right now to mean that it has to be defined for somebody outside the regulated community in addition to those inside the regulated community. Mm-hmm. So we're having terms. I'll give you an example of that too. Most attorneys know what rules of practice mean. It refers to how you present your case before a board. It does not refer to something like how you practice a profession like accountancy. But when we first had rules filed, we had the accountant, well, I wouldn't say, I won't pick a specific board, but we had some boards who were saying, these are the rules you need to practice this profession.
Whereas those that were already...
Rules of practice doesn't mean that, and that needs to be explained.
Where those were already established in the statute that said you had to pass a bar exam or a CPA exam or whatever.
Right, how you practice your profession.
So it comes down to words being either imprecisely used or being susceptible of several definitions.
In that case, plain English would require that practice be defined a specific way that's not the dictionary definition. Mm-hmm. It's how you present a case before a body that is sitting in judgment and hearing your arguments. We mentioned before, too, a very difficult word for a lot of people to understand or pronounce even is adjudicate. And again, I would think plain English would be most successful when it explained that judge was in the middle of that. The JUD means when an agency is acting as a judge. And therefore, an adjudicative proceeding is not that difficult to understand. Agencies either operate as a legislative body gathering information in order to make a decision, or they've already made a decision and somebody is appealing it. Mm-hmm. When the appeal is happening, the agency shifts from a legislative function, which is a policy-making function, to a judicial function, which is there's already a policy in effect. What does it mean in this individual case? Mm-hmm. That's adjudicative. And if you understand the judge is in the middle of that, mm-hmm. It's a plain English way of approaching a term of art that most attorneys understand, but a lot of people outside the profession wouldn't.
Let me just ask you, what review do administrative regulations get before they become enacted in law? An agency, say, comes forward with some of the mistakes you talked about.
They get a tremendous amount of review right now.
There's a legislative committee?
Fine-tooth comb. Yes, there's a legislative committee that reviews all rules. The rulemaking process actually follows the analogy of the legislative process. Rules have the effect of law. Therefore, they have to go through a similar process. They're really laws that do not originate in the legislature. That's one way of thinking about a rule. They have the effect of law, but they're coming from appointed officials as opposed to elected officials. And as a matter of fact, the appointed officials do not get the authority to adopt rules unless the elected officials give that to them. That's called delegation.
So they frame out an area for regulation.
Which is too specific or detailed. The legislature is not going to micromanage, nor should it. It delegates that function to an agency. When the agency is telling the public what certain details of the statute mean, they have to go through a process that's similar to the legislative process. Okay, so that's what I was going to explain to you. We all know that there's, in the legislative process, this one body has a hearing on a bill, and then it goes to a second body and there's a second hearing. Well, there's a corresponding thing in the rulemaking process. The agency has a hearing at which it gathers public response. The people who are going to be affected by the rule have an opportunity in a democracy to say what their opinion is before the thing becomes effective. That's a public hearing. But there's a second level that corresponds to that second thing, the second hearing in the legislative process. And that's done by a legislative committee, Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. They have staff that reviews the rules from a very technical point of view, whether or not the agency has the authority, whether or not it's within legislative intent. These are items that would never come up in the public hearing because the public assumes that the agency has the authority or they wouldn't even be there, right? But when it gets to that second level, it's found out, lo and behold, the agency is charging a fee and they don't have specific authority for that fee. That will never be uncovered in the public hearing unless you have very sophisticated lawyers attending it.
And to shift a little bit, but the agency, the Administrative Rules Agency, has set forth rules
Of its own.
to draft on how someone should
That's
go about
correct.
drafting
A drafting
these rules.
manual. Yes.
One administrative rule that comes to mind that had quite a bit of prominence probably 5 to 7 years ago was the so-called snack tax. And that my recollection was that at some point they said, well, if you buy a package of Twinkies that...
They actually had product names in one draft of the rule. That's right.
And that you would have to pay a tax because clearly you're not going out to the restaurant and having your meal, you're eating on the run.
Right. What about people who buy their meals in supermarkets? That's really the question.
And there was quite a public outcry, and actually that regulation was, I believe, overturned.
Yes.
But that was one of the more prominent administrative regulations. Another one was the, what was it, the so-called sand tax. Apparently, people at Wallace Sands were not pulling into the state parking lot and paying their parking fee and using the beach. They were parking up the road and walking, and then they started saying, you have to pay to go on the beach.
Yep.
And that one evoked a lot of controversy. Well, let's shift a little bit on language.
Sure.
Going back to the mid to late 1700s, our country went through a revolution, but prior to the revolution, Thomas Paine wrote a lot of books, pamphlets, Common Sense. And a lot of people have said that Thomas Paine helped prepare the public to popularly back what was going to happen, which was ultimately the revolution.
And those books were written for citizens, for the people who could they were in plain English at the time. Yeah.
And are writers usually on the leading edge of things before they occur? I mean, is that a necessary element? You have to get the information out to the people, or?
Well, I think writing, the assignment of writing is to resolve contradictions. And I think that's the assignment of law, too. So a lot of times writers will anticipate problems that have not come up in law yet. And in that sense, that's true. There might be a resolution of a conflict that is happening out in the general public. And a writer will be more sensitive to that than a lawmaker initially.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that there's sort of, I had somebody compare it one time to a latent image. When you're in photography, there's a point at which you're developing the negative. And there's a latent image before it becomes literally a positive and before it becomes a photograph. And I think writers a lot of times are dealing with what we might call the negative or the latent image before it's developed. When it becomes developed and formal, then you're in an arena that's similar to law. So that there is kind of an analogy there between a negative, taking a picture, and a positive being the law.
Or planting the seeds of revolution in the common sense, letting
seeds is another perfect analogy.
Letting the people read it, let it fester, let it grow, let it germinate, and then when the time comes. let me just read a...
I think you should read from the
Let me just read this
Constitution.
passage, which comes from a document written over 200 years ago. But government being instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the whole community, and not for the private interest or emolument of any one man, family, or class of men. Therefore, whenever the ends of government are perverted, and public liberty manifestly endangered, and all other means of redress are ineffectual, the people may, and of right, ought to reform the old or establish a new government. The doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. Pretty powerful language.
Excellent quotation.
And it's from our New Hampshire Constitution, the Right of Revolution, Article 10, Part 1. I think that puts in the context of that being included, what the people had gone through.
Yes, that's clearly in reaction to the governor and council, which, by the way, was originally a British governor and an American council. That's why we've survived with GNC, governor and council in New Hampshire.
Here in New Hampshire.
The council had a right of veto almost against the British governor, and that's been written into that historical knowledge is still with us in certain forms of New Hampshire government.
But certainly this indicates that the New Hampshire community had been through several changes in government.
That's correct.
And they didn't consider one government the end-all, be-all means.
That's almost a plain language provision in the Constitution, because it is saying that the rights of the public are the most important determining rights. And whenever you have tyranny or you have a government that is ignoring a large public outcry, that public outcry still has a forum and still has an opportunity to be heard. And getting back to your original question about the writer's role, it seems to me that they're more aware of this type of beginnings of tyranny, where the government has made a decision but has not paid attention to what it really means for the people who have to bring it about. In New Hampshire, those people still have a right to come up and tell the government about it. And local control is in that context, too.
One of the abiding, enduring documents of the debate around government back in when the U.S. Constitution was being adopted was the Federalist Papers by James Madison.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to recognize that there were serious debates going on about how large the legislature should be, how long the term should be, how long people should stay in office.
Very important debates about how power needs to be limited, because they're coming right out of an era where the king was ignoring their concerns and being authoritative and making his power felt without any representation. Taxation without representation is really what we're talking about here. And those debates were in the background to a lot of this, or that idea behind the debates.
Well, one from the Federalist Paper number 57, it talks about the method of government and talking about if people stayed in too long. And it says the means relied on in this form of government for preventing their degeneracy are numerous and various. The most effectual one is such a limitation of the term of appointments as will maintain a proper responsibility to the people. And certainly that alludes as to term limits.
Could have been written yesterday.
Written, well, I guess this was written 1793.
I can see the brown spots all over your book.
Well, the book was
it goes back a ways.
The book was published in 1857, but there's another issue which has been addressed, size of the legislature. Now, New Hampshire has what's called a citizen legislature, 400 people, and then the Senate has 24. 24.
Yeah, it's 424 total.
Now, in Massachusetts, they had 240 in the early 1970s in their House of Representatives, and I believe the late 70s, early 80s, they cut it down to 160. But the Federalist Papers again talk about this issue several pages later, number 58, for those of you that following along at home with your Federalist Paper book here.
Of course, they have a different edition, so but it's all right.
But they talk about the size of the House of Representatives, and they say that the larger the number, the greater will be the proportion of members of limited information and of weak capacities. and they talk about there is an optimum number. If it's too big, then there's too many people
Becomes cumbersome.
to learn and
Yeah.
understand everything, and they fall into the control of a smaller crew.
Yeah, leadership.
And we're obviously at the other end. If it's too small, then certainly it falls into the control of much too few. But
Yeah.
it's interesting that some of the topics raised there are relevant.
A lot of those are still very much alive in New Hampshire. It's interesting how we've even retained the commission form of government still in a number of agencies, like the Liquor Commission or the Public Utilities Commission. And that's a citizen type of government where commissions are actually making policy.
So there'd be 3 or more as opposed to
As opposed to one.
One
Of course, then we've also got statutes that talk about a cabinet form of government, which is the more modern. And New Hampshire is caught between those two ideals, and they're trying to find the balance between those. But the commission form of government, the large citizen legislature, a lot of states, I think, have lost the original concept behind that, which New Hampshire has retained.
Well, there's been quite a bit said over the last 20, 25 years how voter participation has gone down, how people are disenchanted, disillusioned with government, not voting and not being involved.
Feel as though their voices are being heard. Yeah.
And one thing that I came across was a book called The Vermont Papers. It was written by Frank Bryan and John McClarty, recreating democracy on the human scale. And they trace the demise of democracy from the town meetings and then where people stop being an agrarian society and that they go into getting in the car or getting in the wagon and going to the factory, not knowing their neighbors, not having this sense of continuity and sense of community.
Yeah.
And in this, they propose a fairly radical plan, which I won't go into it, but basically breaking the state up into shires and having certain sections of the government in each area, say the Department of Agriculture in an area where there is agriculture as opposed to in the state capital. A radical concept, but certainly very common sense. But do you see us coming back from that sense
I think New Hampshire has retained a lot of that. Unfortunately, a lot of it turns into debates that can't be resolved. I mean, we all know that in the experience of town meeting. You often have, when all voices are heard, you can easily get into paralysis. You have to go forward, too. But I think New Hampshire, by retaining town meetings and by retaining a large citizen legislature and by retaining local control, is making sure that those other voices that are normally silenced are heard. With having 400 representatives, it means we have tremendous representation. I don't know anyone in New Hampshire who doesn't know a representative. But if you're in California, New York, you can live your life very easily without ever knowing what's going on in the legislature.
I was told a story by a state senator who was driving out of state with his license plates and driving along the New Jersey Turnpike, and people were driving by and gawking and waving at him and basically making him feel very important. And he said apparently they don't have legislative plates and it's not a very common occurrence. But I have a quote here which I think seems to capsulize from Vermont Papers, the paradox of politics in the postmodern period. At a moment in history when the technology of communications is improving by quantum leaps, our suspicions of the truth of what we are told and what we know are greater than they've ever been. These suspicions have their source in the oldest and most profound need, our need to govern ourselves. And it goes on to say, a fairly vivid quote, as the watersheds of democracy are sucked dry, the rivers of citizenship are fed our great national institutions grow ever more shallow, and the American public is withering away. Certainly up until the late 80s, that might have been a pertinent quote. What we've seen in the last presidential election cycle certainly shows that, would you agree, there's been a resurgence of citizen democracy?
It's interesting they make an analogy between government by the people and water as a nourishing agent, and without it, the crops die. Most people don't think of government that way anymore. They think of it as interfering rather than as providing the support necessary to promote growth. So I think we're getting back to that a little bit. There's all kinds of books now on the topic of reinventing government and thinking of the original reason why government was created to begin with, more in a steering sense rather than
driving sense.
Yes, rowing sense.
The vivid image of the water and the watershed being sucked dry and the shallow
Vivid image. Yeah.
leads us to your role as a writer, and you have a show that's going to be proposed called The Writer's Eye,
yes.
and that's going to be appearing on cable in several weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you expect or hope for that?
Yeah, I think that the concept behind that is that a lot of writing is visual, and it plugs into what some people have called visual thinking. And the purpose of putting words on paper is really to get to a more immediate visualization, either of character or plot or description even. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a direct analogy between writing and, say, painting or visualizing, mm-hmm. or certainly dreaming, which is also visual. Joseph Conrad said in one of the prefaces to one of his great books, "My purpose is to make you see," and he means his purpose in writing is to make you see. Mm-hmm. And when you develop imagery that is vivid, like the one that you quoted just now of water, again, it helps people to get a concept of what you're talking about. And it's this imagery is plain English, too. This is another side of plain English, because you're visualizing something. You're not relying upon words that have technical meanings that you have to look up in the dictionary. It becomes left brain versus right brain.
I don't want to cut you off, but we're running
out of time.
A little short of time.
Okay.
But I guess I'd ask if you could give me a little more on your show. You're going to be having
yeah, I think we're going to have.
Yeah,
I'm trying to find people who have to write to live. In other words, the people who are defining their lives through the process of writing. Not necessarily professionally published writers, but those who have discovered writing as a way of understanding their lives, providing some therapy, providing some counterpoint. Mm-hmm. At one point I call writing emotional algebra in my own writing, because you have three knowns and you have an X unknown, mm-hmm. and the putting together of the knowns allows you to solve the X, but it's emotional, mm-hmm. rather than mathematical. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be working on ideas like that.
Do you have any guests lined up as yet, or any?
I have a few. They're not generally well known throughout the state,
mm-hmm.
but I'm trying to find people who are not known. It's community access television.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. So basically, we can look forward to this.
Yeah, I have maybe about 10 people lined up so far.
Okay, so we'll be looking for this in early spring.
Yeah.
And be coming
Spring's
on.
a good time to do a show like that.
Come
right.
forward.
The sap will start to move.
Sure, and
the frost heaves level.
And the people come out for their town meetings.
Right.
Well, this is Charles Russell of Democracy, New Hampshire. I'd like to thank you for being with us tonight. Our guest has been Steve Shaw, who is going to have a show called The Writer's Eye we'll be looking forward to. And I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Good evening.